Before Matt Smith was the Doctor, before he was Daemon Targaryen, before he became one of the most divisive yet magnetic figures in modern fandom, there was another role. A role that barely anyone talks about. A role that wasn't splashed across billboards. That didn't come with the pressure of saving a billion-dollar franchise, but one that quietly proved, long before the BBC took a gamble on him, that Matt Smith was destined to become a star. And here's the kicker, it wasn't in Doctor Who. It wasn't in House of the Dragon. It was in a forgotten piece of British sci-fi television that almost no one remembers today, yet it contained every single clue that Smith was already carving his way toward becoming the 11th Doctor. Now, ask yourself this, how does an actor with almost no screen credits, no blockbuster exposure, no Hollywood push suddenly land the biggest sci-fi role in the UK? Was it luck? Was it timing? Or was it the fact that Smith's early sci-fi role already demonstrated that he was more than ready for the madness, the mystery, and the weight of an icon like the Doctor? Stick with me, because what I'm about to reveal is the kind of hidden piece of trivia that even lifelong Doctor Who fans missed. This is one of those forbidden knowledge moments where an obscure corner of television history rewrites how we think about Matt Smith's rise. Let's rewind. It's 2007, Doctor Who has just returned under Russell T Davies. David Tennant is at the height of his popularity, and the BBC is slowly experimenting with spin-offs like Torchwood and the Sarah Jane Adventures. And tucked inside the Sarah Jane Adventures, a show aimed at younger audiences, was a two-part story titled The Nightmare Man. Most fans today remember the aliens, the creepy dream sequences, and the way it explored fear. But what they've forgotten is that this is where Matt Smith first sharpened his teeth on the edges of sci-fi storytelling before anyone thought of him as a future Doctor. Think about that for a second. Smith was an unknown. He didn't have the chiseled jawline of a Hollywood action star. Casting directors kept telling him he looked too strange, too angular, too different to be a leading man. Yet in the Sarah Jane Adventures, he leaned into that weirdness. He turned it into a strength. His performance hinted at a man who could be both alien and deeply human at the same time. Sound familiar? It should, because those exact qualities would define his Doctor just 3 years later. And here's where it gets eerie. In that small blink, and you'll miss it role, Smith brought something unsettling, something almost otherworldly, even though he was just a supporting character. He was already experimenting with that awkward physicality, those darting eyes, that strange mix of vulnerability and menace. Watching it now feels like looking at an early sketch of the 11th Doctor that hadn't yet been painted in full color. But here's the problem nobody noticed. The BBC didn't push the episode. Fans didn't connect the dots, and Smith himself, when asked about it later, downplayed it as just another job. This is where the controversy begins, because when the BBC finally announced Matt Smith as the new Doctor in 2009, people lost their minds. He was too young, too unproven. He looks like a child. Fans sneered. He hasn't earned it. And all the while, buried in the archives, was this forgotten role that showed he had already been preparing for this destiny. Let me put it like this. If you rewatch that story today, you'll see something uncanny. It's almost as if Smith was auditioning for the Doctor years before the BBC made the decision. Like the role found him, rather than the other way around. Now let me ask you something, because I want your thoughts on this. Do you think casting directors actually saw that performance and quietly kept him in the back of their minds? Or was it pure coincidence that a relatively unknown actor with a brief sci-fi credit suddenly became the face of one of the biggest shows in British history? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'll be reading them, because this is where the debate gets fascinating. And hey, if you're the kind of fan who loves uncovering these hidden connections, then this is the channel you need to be subscribed to. Seriously, we break down the stuff no one else dares to touch. So hit that subscribe button right now, because trust me, what's coming next is even wilder. Because Matt Smith's story doesn't stop with a forgotten guest role. The truth is, that performance set a chain reaction in motion. A chain that led directly to Doctor Who, to House of the Dragon, and to his reputation as one of the most unpredictable talents in modern pop culture. But there's a darker side to this story. Because once you realize how good he was, even in those early days, you start to wonder why the industry tried so hard to overlook him. Was Matt Smith nearly lost to television obscurity? And if so, what saved him? The answers are going to shock you. Here's the truth nobody wants to admit: Matt Smith wasn't supposed to make it. Not in the traditional sense. The industry didn't see him as leading man material. He was too unusual, too angular, too young. At the time, studios wanted their sci-fi heroes to look like they'd been carved from stone, square jaws, deep voices, action figure physiques. But Matt Smith, he looked like he'd been drawn from another dimension, and that's exactly why he worked. That forgotten sci-fi role I mentioned wasn't just a coincidence, it was a warning shot. The kind of performance that screamed this guy is different, and that difference isn't a flaw, it's his power. Think about his physicality, the way he moved. He didn't just stand still in a scene, he occupied it. His hands twitched, his posture shifted, his head tilted at odd angles. It was as though he wasn't entirely comfortable in human skin, and that, in retrospect, was the ultimate training ground for playing the Doctor. But here's where the controversy enters the picture. When the BBC announced him as the 11th Doctor, they faced backlash on a scale they weren't ready for. Fans said he was nobody. They said he was too young, too inexperienced, that he'd ruin the show. Remember, this was the era when David Tennant was at the height of his powers, beloved, iconic, a perfect mix of charm and heartbreak. And then suddenly, this 26-year-old with barely a handful of TV credits was supposed to step into that role. It didn't make sense to anyone except the people who had already seen what he could do in that small, overlooked sci-fi performance. Here's the chilling part. I've spoken to fans who went back years later, dug up that role, and said it was obvious. Obvious that Matt Smith was already channeling the same strange alien charisma, the same vulnerability wrapped inside intensity. The exact qualities that would define his Doctor. So why didn't anyone notice at the time? Simple. Because the industry is blind to risk. It doesn't know how to handle actors who don't fit the mold. And in 2007, Matt Smith didn't fit any mold. He was strange, awkward, even off-putting to some viewers. But to those paying attention, that was the point. This is where his story starts to feel almost mythic. Because while the public was doubting him, Matt Smith had already been proving, without anyone realizing it, that he had the instincts, the energy, and the sheer weirdness to step into one of the hardest roles in television. And then something incredible happened. The BBC doubled down. They chose him. Against the odds, against fan opinion, against the risk. Here's where I want you to stop and think. What if they hadn't? What if the BBC had caved to the pressure, gone with a safer, older, more conventional choice? We wouldn't have the 11th Doctor's bow ties. We wouldn't have the Pandorica Opens. We wouldn't have the Day of the Doctor. And we certainly wouldn't have the cultural reappraisal of Smith as one of the most alien, most dynamic Doctors in history. And yet, none of that would have been possible without his pre-Doctor Who Sci-Fi role. That role is the missing puzzle piece. It's the Rosetta Stone that explains why Matt Smith works so well. He'd already been practicing, testing out that otherworldly persona years before the cameras rolled on Series 5. Now, here's the dark irony, because when you rewatch that forgotten performance now, it almost feels like a tragedy, like watching a man standing at the edge of greatness, but surrounded by an industry that couldn't see it. It's haunting. But destiny has a strange way of forcing itself into the spotlight. Smith himself has admitted in interviews that he never saw himself as a big star. He thought he'd be lucky just to get steady work. And yet, when he landed the Doctor, he leaned on those early performances, the ones where he didn't quite fit, the ones where his strangeness was most obvious. That's where he found his power. The same quirks that once made him wrong for leading roles became the very things that made him perfect for the most important sci-fi role in British television. And here's the bigger question, one that fans still argue about today. Did the BBC cast Matt Smith because of that role, or did they ignore it completely and simply stumble into the perfect choice by accident? The answer may never be fully clear, but either way the result is undeniable. That early Sci-Fi story became a prophecy, and Smith fulfilled it. But here's where it gets even more fascinating, because that wasn't the only sign. If you start tracing Matt Smith's career backwards, you find more clues, roles in theatre, in forgotten TV dramas that show the same energy, the same untapped brilliance. And when you put the pieces together, you realize something chilling. Matt Smith didn't just become the Doctor in 2010, he'd been becoming the Doctor all along. The question is, how much of that was choice and how much of it was fate? Because as we'll uncover in the next chapter, Matt Smith's rise wasn't just unlikely, it was almost impossible. And yet, the more you dig, the more you realize he might have been destined for it from the start. Here's the unsettling part of Matt Smith's story. The deeper you look, the harder it becomes to believe it was coincidence. That early, almost forgotten sci-fi role wasn't just an audition for something bigger. It feels in hindsight like an inevitability, like the universe was testing him, throwing him into a smaller story so he could prove to himself and to anyone paying attention that he had the instincts to become the Doctor. Because look at the themes. That character was wrestling with ideas of identity, morality, the vastness of space, and humanity's fragile place in it. Sound familiar? It should. Those are the same philosophical undercurrents that run through Doctor Who. Smith wasn't just playing a part, he was rehearsing the very essence of what makes the Doctor. And this raises a question most fans don't dare to ask: was Matt Smith destined to play the role? Not in the vague sense of got lucky and landed the part. I mean in the stranger, almost cosmic sense that every quirk in his acting, every failed audition, every overlooked TV credit was pushing him closer to one inevitable moment: the bow tie, the TARDIS, the 11th Doctor. Because when he finally arrived on screen in the 11th Ha, he didn't feel like a beginner. He felt ready. Almost too ready, as if he'd been preparing long before the audience caught on. Think about the way he introduces himself in that first story. The manic energy, the bursts of genius, the sudden shifts between warmth and alien coldness, it's all there. And if you line it up against his Sci-Fi performance, the overlap is eerie. It's as though the Doctor had been bleeding through him years before he was officially cast. But here's where the story takes an even stranger turn, because Matt Smith didn't stop embodying that same energy after Doctor Who. If anything, his later roles showed how deeply that alien quality was built into him. Look at The Crown. As Prince Philip, he carried the same restless unpredictability, the same sense of someone who never quite fit the world around him. Look at Morbius, a film many dismissed, but where Smith stole every scene with a performance that was equal parts sinister and magnetic. And then, of course, House of the Dragon. As Daemon Targaryen, Smith weaponized that alien strangeness. He made it dangerous. Suddenly, the qualities that once made him feel otherworldly became terrifying in a medieval fantasy setting. The unpredictable movements, the unnerving smiles, the mercurial switches between love and cruelty. It was pure Doctor, twisted into something darker. And here's the hidden connection nobody talks about. Daemon Targaryen is the anti-Doctor. A character who, like the Time Lord, bends history around him, who manipulates and charms and unsettles. But instead of saving lives, he destroys them. Instead of kindness, cruelty. Instead of hope, fear. Which makes you wonder, was Smith always fated to play these two roles? The Doctor and the anti-Doctor? The hero who heals time and the villain who burns history? Because if you map his career, you see a pattern. A man perpetually caught between light and dark, humanity and otherness, brilliance and chaos. And every performance, whether praised or forgotten, pushes him further down that path. That's why his Sci-Fi role matters. It wasn't just a stepping stone. It was the blueprint. The first sketch of a character type that Smith has returned to again and again across his career. Here's the irony that makes this almost tragic. Most audiences missed it. Critics didn't see the connection. Even some fans still don't. They treat that early role as a footnote, a curiosity at best. But if you pay attention, it's a key to understanding not just Matt Smith's Doctor, but his entire career. Because whether he's in a TARDIS, a throne room, or a Marvel lab, he plays men who don't quite belong. Men who are both magnetic and unsettling, saviors and destroyers. And the root of that archetype lives in that first overlooked sci-fi story. So was it destiny? Maybe. Or maybe it was something stranger. Maybe certain roles find their actors, not the other way around. Maybe Matt Smith was always going to be the 11th Doctor, just as he was always going to be Daemon Targaryen. Two sides of the same coin, two roles that define his brilliance and his alienness in equal measure. And if that's true, then his story isn't just about luck or timing. It's about inevitability. But here's where the mystery deepens, because if that's the case, then the question becomes, what comes next? What's the next role that Smith was meant to play? And will it